The drop wasn't graceful. The ship's hull scraped against something invisible before the alarms cut off, and then everything went silent. Too silent. Mark Brenner gripped the railing, waiting for another jolt, but it didn't come. The viewport outside showed a sky that wasn't black with stars, but crowded with shapes. Huge, metallic shapes. Mark? Dalton's voice came from the pilot's chair, low and uneasy. We're not in Kansas anymore. No kidding. Directly ahead, a structure larger than any Earth city floated in the void, bristling with spires, docking arms, and something that looked a hell of a lot like gun batteries. Smaller craft swarmed around it like angry insects. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. Mark leaned over the pilot's shoulder. We got any read on what those things are? Dalton shook his head. Ship's sensors are throwing garbage. Nothing in the database even close. The comms panel lit up before Mark could answer. A sound came through first. Deep, resonant, almost like a lion's growl dragged through an amplifier. Then words, harsh and unfamiliar, snapped through the channel. Dalton frowned. Translation software's struggling, but I think they just told us to stop moving and prepare to be boarded. Mark gave a humorless chuckle. Of course they did. A shadow fell across the viewport as a long, claw-like docking arm extended toward their ship. The metal scraped against the hull before locking into place. The noise it made was sharp enough to raise goosebumps. Moments later, the airlock cycled, and the smell hit first. Something metallic, mixed with a faint chemical tang. Then came the figures. They weren't uniform in size. Some stood about human height, others towered like industrial cranes. But all wore segmented armor that hissed with some kind of internal mechanism. Helmets with insect-like eyes fixed on them, and weapons that hummed with a soft but deadly vibration pointed their way. One of the taller ones stepped forward, its armor a darker shade than the rest. The alien's voice was a grinding bass rumble, but this time the translator caught up. By order of the Imperial Dominion, you are taken into custody for unauthorized entry into sovereign territory. You will be escorted to the Emperor's court for judgment. Dalton's jaw tightened, but Mark just smiled. Not the warm kind, but the kind that said, I've had worse mornings than this. Sure, Mark said flatly. Lead the way. The aliens clearly expected fear. Mark could see it in the way they watched every twitch of his muscles, in the way their weapons stayed locked. But fear wasn't coming. He'd been a Marine for 12 years, fought in 2 brush wars, and seen what orbital bombardments did to cities. This question mark. This was just a parade with fancy armor. The escort brought them through a docking tunnel into the massive structure. It wasn't a station, Mark realized. It was a fortress. Walls were carved with symbols that had the weight of centuries, floors polished like glass, but reinforced with embedded metal veins. Every corridor they passed through had more armed guards, all of them staring at the 2 humans like they were rabid dogs on a short leash. The court was worse. It opened into a hall so vast it felt like stepping outdoors. Pillars taller than skyscrapers lined the chamber, each carved into the likeness of some alien monarch. At the far end, a throne of black stone rose high above the floor, and on it sat a figure draped in layered armor and flowing crimson cloth. The helmet was gone, revealing a face that was half flesh, half metal, eyes burning like molten gold. This had to be the Emperor. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked them over, as if sizing up cattle at auction. The silence dragged until it felt like a rope pulling tight. Finally, his voice rolled through the hall. You come to my empire unbidden, bearing no mark of allegiance. Speak before I decide your fate. Dalton shifted uncomfortably, but Mark stepped forward, meeting that molten gaze without flinching. "We didn't come anywhere," Mark said. "We got thrown here by a busted jump drive. And as for deciding our fate..." He let his eyes sweep the hall, lingering on the guards, the weapons, the pomp and ceremony. "I've seen worse." A murmur rippled through the court. The Emperor's metal fingers drummed once on the arm of his throne. Somewhere in the shadows above, Mark could feel the weight of 100 alien eyes on him. They didn't know it yet, but the game had just changed. Mark didn't move after the words left his mouth. He didn't smirk, didn't blink, didn't give the Emperor the satisfaction of seeing any flicker of uncertainty. He'd learned a long time ago that in a room full of predators, the one who twitched first was prey. The murmur in the court died slowly, like the air being sucked from a room. Rows of guards shifted their grip on their weapons, more out of reflex than intent. The Emperor's gaze was steady, almost lazy, like a man staring at a problem he hadn't decided whether to crush or keep. "You've seen worse?" the Emperor repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Mark's tone stayed flat. "Yeah. Where I come from, we bury people by the thousands before breakfast. And we don't even have a throne room for it." Dalton flinched beside him, not from fear of the aliens, but from the reckless way Mark was leaning in. The Emperor's golden eyes narrowed, and his metal hand clenched around the throne's armrest with a sound like a blade being drawn. "You speak as if the Dominion is beneath you," the Emperor said. "I speak as if your threats don't impress me," Mark shot back. A ripple of hostility ran through the guards. Weapons shifted forward in unison, the hum of their power cores filling the air like an approaching storm. The Emperor raised his flesh hand, and the hall fell into silence again. "Interesting," he said. "You are either foolish or forged in something harder than most species survive." He leaned forward. "I will know which before I decide how many pieces to scatter you in." He gestured sharply, and 2 guards stepped forward. They weren't the insect-eyed soldiers from the docking bay. These were bigger, broader, with armor that glistened like oil and strange twin-bladed weapons humming in their hands. "Bring them to the gauntlet," the Emperor commanded. Dalton frowned. "The hell's the gauntlet?" "Best not to ask," Mark muttered as the guards flanked them and shoved them toward the side of the throne room. The corridors beyond were narrower, darker. The walls here were bare, stripped of the ceremonial carvings in the main hall. These weren't for show. They were functional, like the guts of a warship. Every so often, Mark caught sight of mechanical panels that hissed softly, releasing bursts of vapor that smelled faintly metallic. Dalton was clearly trying to measure the situation. "Think this is a test?" "Probably," Mark said. "Question is it the kind you can pass? Or the kind they use to make an example?" They descended a flight of stairs carved directly into the hull's inner plating, emerging into a massive chamber. The air here was different, hotter, heavier, with the faint vibration of machinery running through the floor. In the center was a circular pit, maybe 50 meters across. The walls rose high and curved inward, lined with rows of alien spectators. Some were in armor, others in robes, but all shared the same look. Anticipation. Dalton muttered, "Feels like a damn coliseum." "That's because it is," Mark replied. A voice boomed across the chamber, echoing unnaturally, as if carried through hidden speakers. "By decree of the Emperor, the humans will prove their worth in the gauntlet. Survive, and they may speak again. Fail, and their remains will be fed to the vermin." The crowd responded with a low, vibrating hum, some alien equivalent of cheering. 2 gates slid open on opposite ends of the pit. From one, Mark and Dalton were shoved forward. The floor felt gritty under their boots. coated in some fine dust that clung like ash. From the other, something stepped out. It was tall, easily 3 meters, its frame bulkier than any human's. The creature's body was plated in a chitin-like armor, but it moved with disturbing speed, its long forelimbs ending in clawed hooks that glistened wetly under the lights. Its face was a nightmare of mandibles and black, lidless eyes. Dalton swore under his breath. "We didn't bring weapons." Mark's eyes swept the pit. "We've got the floor." Dalton blinked. "What the hell does that?" The alien charged. Mark moved first, grabbing Dalton by the collar and yanking him to the side. The creature's claws tore into the ground where they'd been standing, sending up a spray of dust and shards. Mark hit the ground rolling, his hand closing around a loose chunk of plating. It wasn't much, but in a fight, anything could be a weapon. He came up on one knee and hurled it, not at the alien's chest, but at one of its black eyes. The chunk bounced harmlessly off the armor plating around the socket, but the distraction bought him a second. "Split!" Mark barked, and the two of them moved in opposite directions, forcing the creature to pivot between them. Dalton found a second piece of debris, a twisted length of piping, and swung it like a bat. The alien swiped at him, and Dalton ducked just in time, the hook slicing through the pipe with ease. Mark didn't waste the moment. He closed in on the creature's flank, slamming his boot into the back of one of its spindly legs. The joint bent inward with a wet pop, and the creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal mixed with boiling water. It turned on him instantly, mandibles snapping, but Mark was already backing away, keeping his stance low. "Dalton, eyes!" Dalton caught on fast. He feinted left, then lunged right, jabbing the broken pipe into the soft gap between two plates at the base of the alien's neck. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to make the thing reel back. Mark stepped in with a low, brutal kick to the injured leg again. This time the joint gave out completely, and the alien crashed to the ground with a deafening thud. The crowd erupted, not in shock, but in that same low, hungry hum. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed the jagged edge of the pipe from Dalton and drove it into the alien's throat with all the force he had. There was a spray of dark fluid, a horrible gurgle, and then the creature went still. The hum of the crowd rose to a fever pitch. A gate opened behind them. Dalton wiped the fluid from his arm. "Please tell me that was it." Mark shook his head. "They don't call it a gauntlet for one fight." 2 more came through the gate, smaller this time, but faster, moving on 4 limbs, their bodies sleek and segmented like giant armored hounds. Their mouths were filled with rows of needle teeth, and a thick, clear fluid dripped from them, sizzling where it touched the floor. Mark stepped back, scanning the pit again. No more debris big enough to serve as a weapon. "Stay moving," he said. "If they circle, we're dead." The creatures split instantly, one coming for each of them. Dalton dodged his first, but the thing pivoted like a snake, lunging again. Its teeth grazed his arm, slicing through his jacket. The fabric smoked where the saliva touched it. Mark had less room. His opponent came straight in, jaws wide. He sidestepped, grabbed the thing's neck plating, and wrenched hard, using its momentum to smash it into the wall. The impact dazed it, but didn't break anything. Dalton was holding his own, barely, using quick footwork to keep out of reach. But one slip would end it. Mark made a decision. He drove his knee into the side of his opponent's skull, stunning it long enough for him to grab one of its forelimbs. With a violent twist, he tore it free in a spray of that same sizzling fluid. The thing screamed, high and keening, and Mark didn't give it the chance to recover. He jammed the severed limb down its throat until it collapsed, twitching. Dalton's opponent noticed too late. Mark charged across the pit, the severed limb still in hand, and slammed it into the side of the second creature's head. The blow staggered it just long enough for Dalton to grab its neck and snap it in a sharp, efficient motion. They both stood there, panting, staring at the bodies. The hum of the crowd was now deafening. Above them, the Emperor was on his feet. "I see," the Emperor said slowly, his voice cutting through the noise. "You are not prey." Mark met his gaze from the pit. "Told you." The Emperor tilted his head. "And yet you bleed." Mark glanced down at his arm, just a shallow slice from one of the hounds, already crusting over. He looked back up. "Yeah, so do you." The Emperor didn't react immediately. Then, after a long pause, he raised his metal hand and snapped his fingers. The gates to the pit opened again, not for more creatures, but for the guards. They came down in perfect formation, their weapons pointed not at Mark and Dalton, but toward the crowd, as if keeping the other spectators from interfering. "Bring them to me," the Emperor ordered. The walk back to the throne room felt longer this time. The guards didn't shove them, didn't have to. The respect in their posture was subtle, but it was there. When they stood before the Emperor again, he rose from his throne and descended the steps himself. Up close, Mark could see that the metal parts of his body weren't decorative. They were battle-worn, scratched and pitted with old damage. "You were unarmed," the Emperor said, "yet you killed the Gauntlet's first 3 trials in minutes. No fear, no hesitation. Why?" Mark didn't hesitate with his answer. "Because where I'm from, hesitation gets you killed, and fear is just the thing that makes it happen faster." The Emperor studied him for a long moment, then turned slightly toward his court. Perhaps these humans have a place in the Dominion after all. Mark caught the subtle shift in the tone of the crowd. Some murmurs of agreement, some of discontent. Whatever the Emperor had planned next, it wouldn't be simple. And Mark wasn't sure yet if surviving the Gauntlet was a victory, or just the start of something worse. The Emperor didn't return to his throne right away. He stood in front of Mark and Dalton, the weight of the entire court pressing in like a physical thing. Every alien in the chamber was watching, and Mark could feel their unspoken verdicts hanging in the air like blades. "You've survived the Gauntlet," the Emperor said. "That grants you the right to stand here and speak without chains. But survival in the Dominion is not about strength alone. It is about knowing which enemies you may face directly, and which you must gut in the dark." Dalton muttered under his breath. "Great. So now it's politics." Mark didn't respond. He kept his gaze locked on the Emperor, but his ears tracked the shuffling in the court. Robes swishing, armor clinking, low murmurs passing between alien nobles. The Emperor gestured toward them. "You are outsiders. The court sees you as intruders. Some see you as curiosities, others as threats." Mark gave the faintest shrug. "Sounds familiar?" One of the nobles stepped forward from the crowd. He was tall, thin, with a pale, almost translucent skin that stretched over long bones. His eyes were bright silver, unblinking, and his robe shimmered with threads that seemed to crawl like living things. "I am Lord Vale," the noble said, his voice smooth but sharp, like a blade being polished. "And I say the humans are an insult. They trespass in our space, kill Dominion beasts in the Emperor's own arena, and speak as if they have the right to stand equal." He let the words hang for a moment, his gaze sweeping over Mark with open disdain. "I demand they be put to the trial of shadows." A ripple of interest passed through the court. Dalton's brow furrowed. "I'm guessing that's not a friendly dinner." The Emperor's gaze slid toward Vielle. "The trial of shadows is no spectacle, Lord Vielle. It is death for most who enter. All the better to see what they truly are, Vale replied smoothly. If they survive, perhaps they are worthy. If not, the Dominion wastes no further breath on them. Mark's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Different face, different world, but the same smug tone he'd heard from politicians and officers who loved watching others fail. Fine, Mark said before Dalton could speak. We'll do your trial. Dalton turned his head sharply. Mark Dash. Mark's voice was flat. We already proved we can survive things that want to kill us face to face. Now they want to see if we can do it when it's uglier. We can. The Emperor regarded him for a moment, then inclined his head slightly. So be it. The trial begins at the next dark cycle. Until then, you will be housed in the guest barracks. His gaze hardened. Do not mistake this for mercy. The guest barracks were nothing more than a converted storage deck with a pair of narrow bunks bolted to the floor and a single wall vent that exhaled warm, metallic-smelling air. The door wasn't locked, at least not physically, but Mark could feel the hum of a containment field in the frame. Dalton dropped onto one of the bunks. You know, you could have at least asked what the Trial of Shadows is before you agreed. Mark sat on the opposite bunk, elbows on his knees. Didn't matter. If I said no, they'd kill us anyway. At least this way we pick the terms. Dalton shook his head. Picking the terms doesn't mean walking into a death trap with a smile. Mark didn't answer. His mind was already turning the possibilities over. Trials, gauntlets, arenas. Every culture had its way of proving dominance. The difference here was that the Emperor seemed just as curious about them as the court was hostile. That curiosity might keep them alive, if they could play it right. Hours passed. The light in the ceiling dimmed to a dull glow, signaling the shift into the station's night cycle. The hum in the doorframe cut out, and the panel slid open. 2 guards entered, not the insect-eyed soldiers from before, but tall, broad-shouldered beings with armor that seemed fused directly to their skin. They didn't speak, only motioned for Mark and Dalton to follow. The trial's location wasn't in the fortress's ceremonial halls, nor in the arena pits. The guards led them down service corridors, past unmarked bulkheads, into the kind of maintenance shafts that smelled of oil and hot metal. Eventually, they came to a massive circular hatch. One guard pressed his palm against a panel, and the hatch rolled open with a hiss. Beyond it was darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light spilling in from the corridor. The other guard handed each of them a short, curved blade with a serrated back edge. The hilt was wrapped in a material that felt like scaled leather. "No other tools," the guard said in a voice like grinding stone. "No light, no map. Survive until the second cycle and the trial is complete." Dalton raised an eyebrow. Survive what? The guard only bared teeth that looked like shards of obsidian. "You will know soon enough." Mark tested the weight of the blade in his hand. Balanced, deadly enough for close work, useless for anything at range, which meant whatever they'd be facing would be close. He stepped through the hatch without another word. Dalton followed, and the door sealed behind them, cutting off the last hint of light. The darkness was absolute. Not the kind you got in a city blackout, not the kind where your eyes eventually adjusted. This was deep cave black, thick and smothering. Mark kept his breathing slow, listening. Somewhere far off, there was movement. "Sounds like," Dalton whispered, then stopped as another sound cut him off. A slow, wet, dragging noise, followed by a faint clicking, like claws tapping against metal. Mark's instincts screamed. He motioned for Dalton to move, and they began edging along what felt like a wall, one hand trailing against it to keep direction. The clicking grew louder. Something brushed against Mark's boot, light, quick. Too small to be one of the arena beasts, but it moved with the confidence of something that wasn't afraid. Dalton hissed, "Something's behind us." Mark didn't turn immediately. He waited until the sound was close enough that he could hear the faint rasp of breath. Then he spun, dropping low, and drove the blade upward in a sharp, practiced motion. The steel met something hard, skidding off before biting into softer tissue. There was a screech, high and furious, and the sound of claws raking across the floor. Dalton lunged in beside him, his blade flashing once in the dark. Something heavy thudded against the wall, then slid to the floor. The smell hit next, acrid, almost burning. "One down," Mark said quietly. They didn't have long to breathe. From somewhere deeper in the dark came more clicks, this time in multiples. Dalton swallowed. "They're hunting in packs." The next hour was nothing but movement and noise. They never saw their attackers clearly, only shapes in the dark, claws scraping against steel, the flash of teeth in the briefest glints of some alien bioluminescence. Mark fought without hesitation, his strikes aimed for joints, soft spots, and gaps in armor. Dalton kept pace, grunting with effort each time he connected. The blades grew slick, the floor more treacherous. They lost track of how many they killed. At one point they found a narrow alcove, a maintenance recess just big enough for them to crouch in. They took it, catching their breath. Dalton leaned back against the wall. "This is insane. They dump us in here with things we can't see, no idea where to go." "That's the point," Mark said. "This isn't about killing the creatures. It's about watching us survive the kind of fight that wears you down until you make a mistake." Dalton's voice was tight. "And when we make that mistake?" Mark's grip tightened on his blade. "We don't." They moved again, following a faint current of air. Mark's best guess at finding another exit, or at least a defensible spot. The clicking noises had thinned, but the silence was worse. Then came the whisper. It wasn't in English. The words were liquid and sharp, carrying from somewhere ahead. Another voice answered, closer this time. Dalton tensed. "That's not one of the creatures." "No," Mark said, his tone low. "That's someone using the trial as cover." They moved slower now, blades ready. The voices drew closer until two figures stepped into the faintest glow spilling from a crack in the wall plating. They weren't guards. They weren't arena beasts. They were humanoid, slender, wrapped in dark fabric that broke up their outline, masks covering their faces. The weapons in their hands weren't blades. They were short-barreled firearms. Dalton's eyes widened. "Assassins!" Mark didn't waste breath. He dove forward before the first shot could line up, his blade punching up under the first assassin's arm and into the ribs. The figure convulsed and went down without a sound. Dalton lunged for the second, grabbing the weapon arm and wrenching it sideways as the shot went off. The muzzle flash was blinding in the dark, and the sound made Mark's ears ring. Dalton drove his knee into the assassin's gut, then slammed his blade into the side of the masked head. Both bodies hit the floor. Mark crouched, pulling the firearm from the dead assassin's grip. It was light, alien in design, but the trigger and grip were intuitive enough. "They weren't here for the trial," Dalton said. "They were here for us." "Vile," Mark said. "He's not waiting for the trial to finish." They kept moving after that, faster now. Whatever the trial was supposed to be, it had turned into an ambush, and that meant every minute they stayed in the dark was another chance for someone to finish what Vielle had started. Hours blurred together. The glow from the crack in the wall was the only real light they saw, until the faintest shift in the air told Mark they were near a larger opening. They emerged into a vast chamber, dimly lit by strips of pale light embedded in the ceiling. At the far end was another hatch, the kind that meant an exit. Between them and it were 3 more of the pack creatures, crouched low, their eyes reflecting the light. Behind them, watching from a raised platform, stood Lord Vile himself. Mark smiled coldly. "Guess we made it to the finals." The 3 creatures crouched in the dim light, their bodies low and tense, tails twitching like coiled whips. The metal floor beneath them bore deep claw gouges, signs they'd fought and fed here before. Their mouths hung open slightly, clear saliva dripping and hissing where it touched the steel. Mark didn't look at them first. He looked at Vile. The noble stood on the raised platform, with the posture of someone convinced nothing in the room could touch him. His silver eyes were like polished coins, cold and reflective. 2 armored figures flanked him, guards in the same fused armor Mark had seen before, but heavier, almost plated like walking tanks. Dalton muttered without taking his eyes off the beasts. "Pretty sure the rules don't say the trial ends with the guy who ordered it watching." Mark's grip tightened on the alien firearm he'd taken from the assassins. "Yeah, that's because this isn't the trial anymore. It's an execution with an audience of 1. Voile's voice carried down into the chamber, smooth as oil. "You've done well to make it this far, human. But skill in the dark does not make you invincible. This ends now, before the Emperor makes the mistake of thinking you are more than you are." Dalton called back, "That confidence in your pets is real cute. Let's see if they're better than the ones we've already killed." Vile's smile didn't waver. He gave a flick of his fingers, and the creatures launched forward. Mark raised the firearm and squeezed the trigger. The weapon spat a burst of blue-white energy, the recoil sharper than expected. The lead beast veered at the last second, the shot scorching a line across its flank but not slowing it. Dalton sidestepped another, slashing with his blade. The serrated edge caught in the creature's foreleg, ripping a long tear in the muscle. It howled, the sound rattling the chamber walls. Mark dropped the firearm, it wasn't going to be quick enough, and met his attacker head on. He ducked low as it lunged, driving his blade into the softer flesh just behind the jaw hinge. The impact jarred his arm, but he shoved upward, feeling the resistance give way. The beast convulsed, then collapsed in a heap. Dalton was backing up fast, his beast circling for another strike. The third had veered wide, looking for an opening to come at them from behind. "Left," Mark barked, and Dalton pivoted just in time to avoid the snap of those needle teeth. Mark snatched up the fallen firearm again and fired point-blank into the side of the beast Dalton had wounded. The energy blast blew through its ribs in a flash of scorched chitin and steaming flesh. The third beast hesitated for half a heartbeat at the sight, then lunged straight at Mark. He let it come, stepping into the charge instead of back. His shoulder slammed into its chest, his knife hand driving upward under the chin. The serrated blade punched through the roof of its mouth, and it went limp instantly. The chamber went silent, except for the hiss of burning flesh. Mark kicked the last carcass aside and looked up at Vielle. "That the best you've got?" Vielle's smile thinned. "You misunderstand. That was merely the warm-up." He gestured, and his 2 guards stepped down from the platform. Up close, they were even bigger than they'd looked, each easily 8 feet tall, with armor that shifted and flexed as if part of their skin. Their hands ended not in fingers, but in hooked metal claws. Dalton muttered, "Of course they're not just watching." Mark tossed him the alien firearm. "Make it count." The guards came fast for their size, moving with the smooth precision of trained killers. Mark met the first head-on, their blades clashing in a screech of metal. The guard's strength was monstrous, shoving Mark back a full step. Dalton opened fire on the second, the blue-white bursts punching holes in the armor but not dropping it. The thing kept coming, swiping at Dalton's head with a clawed backhand. Dalton ducked, rolled, and fired again into the exposed joint at the armpit. This time the guard snarled and staggered. Mark ducked under a sweeping hook from his opponent, slashing for the knee. Sparks flew as the serrated edge bit into the armor plating, not deep enough to cripple, but enough to make the guard snarl. The counterstrike came fast, a knee to Mark's gut that knocked the wind out of him. He stumbled but didn't fall, twisting with the momentum to bring his blade across the guard's throat. The metal screeched in protest before finally giving way. A gush of dark fluid sprayed, and the guard collapsed, twitching. Dalton had driven his opponent back against the wall now, firing into the same damaged joint again and again until the armor split. The last shot took the guard's head halfway off, and it slumped to the floor. Vael's expression was different now. Not fear, exactly, but the first hint of realizing his plan wasn't as neat as he thought. Mark took a step toward the platform. You sent assassins into the trial. You sent your pets. You sent your guards. You still breathing because I'm letting you. Vael's voice was cold. You won't touch me. The moment you do, every guard in the court will cut you down. Mark's mouth twitched in something close to a smile. Then maybe you should hope I keep letting you talk. From behind them, the sound of heavy doors opening filled the chamber. A new set of footsteps entered, not the synchronized march of soldiers, but something slower, heavier. The Emperor stepped through, flanked by 6 of his own elite guards. His molten gold eyes swept over the bodies, then landed on Vael. I was told the trial of shadows was proceeding as tradition demands, the Emperor said, his voice low but carrying. This is not tradition. Vael bowed his head slightly. Majesty, the humans are dangerous. I sought only to ensure the trial was worthy of them. You sought to kill them before I could make my own judgment, the Emperor cut in. You turned my trial into your execution pit. Vael's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. The Emperor stepped closer to the platform. You forget your place, Lord Vael. You serve at my will, not your own ambition. His gaze slid to Mark and Dalton. And you forget what the gauntlet has already shown. These humans will not break as easily as you think. Dalton muttered under his breath. I'm starting to like the guy. Mark didn't answer. He knew better than to assume the Emperor's favor meant safety. The Emperor turned to them. You have survived the gauntlet. You have survived the trial of shadows, even twisted as it was. You have killed beasts bred for war and soldiers trained to end wars. That is useful. Mark's voice was steady. You planning to use us, then? The Emperor's eyes gleamed faintly. In the Dominion, everything of value is used. Vael's voice cut in sharply. Majesty, they are still intruders. Enough, the Emperor said without looking at him. They will be given quarters in the upper decks and access to the Dominion's armory, and they will serve me until I decide otherwise. Dalton blinked. Serve you how? The Emperor's molten gaze lingered on him for a moment before answering. There is a war brewing at the Dominion's borders. You will go where I send you, fight who I tell you to fight, and in return, you will live. Mark studied him. And if we say no? The Emperor's smile was thin. Then you will die. Slowly. The walk back to the upper decks was quiet, save for the soft hum of the lifts and the occasional creak of the station's superstructure. The new quarters were far from the storage deck they'd been dumped in before. Private rooms, clean air, even a small viewport looking out into the stars. Dalton dropped into one of the chairs. So we're mercs now? For an alien emperor? Mark stood by the viewport, watching the slow drift of ships outside. We're survivors. Right now that means working for him. Dalton frowned. And later? Mark's eyes stayed on the stars. Later we figure out who's really in charge in this empire. And if it's not him, or if it shouldn't be him, we deal with that when we get there. Dalton gave a short, humorless laugh. Guess we've seen worse. Mark finally turned from the viewport, the faintest edge of a smile on his face. Yeah, we have. The summons came at the break of the station's artificial dawn cycle. The lights in the quarters brightened slowly, simulating sunrise, though Mark could feel in his bones it was all theater. Metal walls didn't care about dawn. The door hissed open without a knock. A tall figure in black armor stepped inside, carrying a tablet-like device. His face was hidden behind a smooth mask, with only a vertical slit for the eyes. "Orders," he said in a voice that sounded half human, half processed through machinery. "You depart within the hour." Dalton was still half asleep, sitting up on the bunk. "Depart where?" The figure held out the device. "The Emperor's words are recorded. You will view them privately. Your escort will meet you at Docking Arm 17. He turned and left without another word. The recording activated with a simple touch. The Emperor's molten gold eyes filled the screen. "Humans," his voice began, low and deliberate. "The Dominion has a frontier world named Carid Prime. It is a strip of stone and dust with little value, except that it sits on the crossing point of 3 warp routes. Whoever controls Carid controls the border. My enemies know this. They have taken a mining colony there as a foothold. You will take it back for me." Mark exchanged a glance with Dalton. "You will have a ship," the Emperor continued, "and a small strike team from my guard. But make no mistake, this is not a mission for them. They will follow you, or they will die. The enemy is not a beast, but a rival faction. They call themselves the Ulthari. They will not expect you. Use that." The recording ended with the faintest curve of his lips. They didn't waste time packing. There wasn't much to pack. The escort turned out to be 4 Dominion soldiers in dark gray armor, faces hidden behind insect-eyed helmets. Each carried a rifle-like weapon that looked more suited for vaporizing walls than shooting people. Their transport was a sleek, narrow craft docked in the shadow of the fortress's bulk. The hull was painted in a deep, matte black that seemed to swallow the station's light. Dalton whistled. "That's a stealth ship if I've ever seen one." One of the Dominion soldiers turned his head slightly. "It is not stealth. It is death that does not announce itself." "Cute slogan," Dalton muttered. The jump to Carid Prime was short. The ship's viewport went from the swirl of hyperspace to a barren expanse of rock and sand. In the distance, jagged mountains rose like the spines of a buried beast. The mining colony sat in the shadow of one of those ridges. From orbit, Mark could see the grid of structures, prefab shelters, processing plants, and the tall skeletal towers of drilling rigs. Smoke drifted from several points in the colony, but no Dominion flags flew. The pilot's voice came through the comm. "Enemy patrols detected on the north and west perimeters. Recommend entry through the south ridge." Mark nodded. "Take us down low and slow. I want us under their sensors before we get close." Dalton strapped in beside him. "You got a plan for once we're down there?" "Yeah," Mark said. "Make them think we're not worth shooting at, then make them regret it." They sat down in a rocky gulch less than a kilometer from the colony's southern edge. The air was thin but breathable, carrying the sharp tang of ozone from the drilling equipment. The Dominion soldiers moved with crisp precision, but Mark could see it in their posture. They weren't used to taking orders from outsiders. That was fine. He didn't need them to like it, just to follow it. "Rule 1, Mark said quietly as they moved toward the colony. "We move fast, we hit harder, and we don't get cute with drawn-out firefights. In and out before they can call in reinforcements." Dalton added, "Rule 2, if something moves and it's not us, assume it's hostile until it proves otherwise." They reached the colony's outer fence, a crude barrier of electrified mesh and metal poles. It had been patched in places with whatever scrap the Ulthari had on hand. Mark crouched low, studying the two guards at the nearest gate. Their armor was light, their weapons older models, and their body language screamed boredom. "Two-man patrol," Dalton murmured. "We could take them before they know what hit them." "Not yet," Mark said. "We're ghosts until we're not." They circled wide, finding a spot where the fence sagged and the power lines had been cut. Slipping through was easy. Inside the colony, the streets between the prefab structures were eerily quiet. A few civilians, miners by the look of them, moved quickly from building to building, heads down. No one met their eyes. The first Ulthari patrol came around a corner without warning, 4 soldiers in mismatched armor, carrying rifles slung over their shoulders. Mark didn't hesitate. He closed the distance in a dead sprint, slamming his blade into the throat of the lead soldier before the man even registered movement. Dalton dropped the second with a sharp twist of his neck, the crack echoing off the prefab walls. The Dominion soldiers handled the last 2 with clinical efficiency, their energy weapons punching neat holes through armor and flesh alike. Mark dragged the bodies into a side alley. "Strip the armor," he said. Dalton raised an eyebrow. "You want us playing dress-up?" "I want us walking through their checkpoints without getting lit up. That means looking like them." The stolen armor was a poor fit, but passable at a distance. The helmets filtered the air and distorted their voices just enough to hide the fact they weren't Ulthari. They moved deeper into the colony, past more patrols and into the heart of the mining complex. The drilling rigs loomed overhead, their skeletal frames groaning in the wind. The main processing plant was a squat, windowless block of metal with 2 guarded entrances. Mark stopped in the shadow of a rig. "That's the hub. Take it out, and they lose their reason to be here." Dalton frowned, "and probably half the colony's life support with it." Mark's tone was flat. "They'll live. The Ulthari won't." They approached the plant in 2 teams, Mark and Dalton on one side, the Dominion soldiers on the other. Mark gave the signal, and they hit both entrances at once. The first 2 guards went down in silence, throats cut before they could shout. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hot metal and chemicals. Pipes and conveyor systems rattled overhead, carrying raw ore deeper into the facility. An Ulthari squad rounded a corner ahead. Mark dropped one with a blade to the gut, yanking the man forward to use as a shield as the others fired. Energy bolts hissed past, scorching the walls. Dalton took another down with a clean shot to the head. The Dominion soldiers swept in from the opposite side, cutting the remaining Ulthari to pieces in seconds. At the plant's control center, Mark scanned the panels. Most of it was alien tech, but the basics weren't that different from human mining systems. He found the main power feed and yanked 2 thick cables free. Sparks spat across the floor, and the deep thrum of the machinery began to die. Alarms wailed instantly. Dalton grinned behind his helmet. "Guess we're not ghosts anymore." Mark's voice was cold. "Good. Let them come." They fought their way back toward the South Ridge, leaving chaos in their wake. Ulthari soldiers poured into the streets, confused and shouting over the alarm sirens. Civilians scattered, doors slamming shut. The Dominion soldiers were efficient, but it was Mark and Dalton who broke the Ulthari's nerve. They moved like predators in a herd, hitting hard, never staying in one place long enough to get pinned. By the time they reached the outer fence again, the colony was in full retreat. The Ulthari weren't chasing. They were scrambling to regroup. Back aboard the ship, the Dominion pilot didn't speak until they'd cleared the atmosphere. "Report to the Emperor will be immediate." Dalton leaned back in his seat, peeling off the stolen helmet. "I think we just made his point for him." Mark didn't answer right away. He was staring at the viewport, at the shrinking shape of Carid Prime below. Something about it itched at him. How quickly the Ulthari had broken, how lightly they'd guarded the plant. It hadn't been a stronghold. It had been bait. Mark couldn't shake the itch. The colony hadn't been defended like a border jewel. It had been manned like an afterthought. The Ulthari soldiers were mismatched, their patrol routes lazy, their reaction time slow. Even the plant's security grid had been a joke compared to what the Emperor's briefing implied. Dalton noticed, too. He leaned over from the next seat on the shuttle as the barren curve of Carid Prime shrank behind them. "Not exactly the nightmare they sold us," he said. "I've seen drunk dock gangs guard liquor shipments tighter than that." Mark didn't respond. He watched the tactical readout in the corner of the viewport, a slow, spinning wireframe of the planet, with heat signatures marking the scattered Ulthari units they'd bypassed. None of them were moving to retake the plant. Instead, they were leaving. "Dalton," Mark said quietly, "those patrols we avoided? They're heading west, not toward the colony, away from it." Dalton frowned. "Retreat?" "Not retreat," Mark said. "Redeployment." The pilot's voice crackled over the comm. "Inbound transmission from the fortress. The Emperor will receive your report now." Mark didn't look away from the readout. "Patch it." The viewport flickered, replaced by the Emperor's molten gold eyes and the smooth, deliberate voice that carried even through static. "Report, human." Mark didn't sugarcoat it. "Carid Prime is secure. The Ulthari forces broke faster than expected, almost too fast." The Emperor tilted his head slightly. "Too fast?" "They weren't dug in. They were sitting on the colony like they knew it didn't matter. Either they wanted us to take it, or they didn't care if we did." For a fraction of a second, the Emperor's expression didn't change. Then, almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowed. "Return at once." The transmission cut without ceremony. Dalton stared at Mark. "You think he knew?" Mark leaned back, jaw tightening. "If he didn't before, he does now." The return trip should have been quiet. Should have been. Halfway through the jump corridor, alarms began to scream in the cockpit. The Dominion pilot's fingers danced across the console, chittering curses in his native tongue. "What is it?" Mark called. The pilot's voice was clipped. "Interdiction field. The jump corridor is collapsing ahead of us." Dalton cursed. "Meaning." "Meaning," Mark said grimly. "Someone's about to pull us out of hyperspace in the middle of nowhere." The transition hit like a brick wall. One moment the stars were stretched into streaks. The next, they snapped into pinpoints against a backdrop of cold black. The ship shuddered violently as the systems reoriented. And then they saw it. A swarm of Ulthari ships hung in space ahead, their hulls bristling with angular armor plates and weapons pods that looked like spines. They weren't warships in the Dominion sense, sleek and heavily shielded. They were built for speed and swarming numbers. Dalton whistled low. "That's a lot more than the Emperor said we'd see out here." "They weren't defending Carid," Mark said flatly. "They were waiting for whoever came to take it." The pilot began evasive maneuvers immediately, rolling the shuttle hard to port. The first volley from the Ulthari lit up space where they'd just been, energy bolts and kinetic slugs scattering like a meteor shower. The Dominion soldiers strapped into firing positions along the shuttle's hull ports, their weapons flashing in rapid pulses. The Ulthari ships moved like predators, circling fast and darting into fire before peeling away. Mark moved to the nearest weapons station, scanning the tactical overlay. "They're hurting us, cutting off the jump vector back to the fortress." Dalton slid into the station beside him. "So what's the move?" Mark's jaw tightened. We don't run. We punch through before they close the noose. The Ulthari weren't expecting a countercharge. Mark had the pilot vector straight for the densest cluster of enemy ships, weaving just enough to throw off their aim. The Dominion soldiers poured fire into anything that crossed their path, tearing holes in smaller craft and forcing larger ones to peel away. Dalton grinned savagely as one Ulthari ship spun out of control and detonated against a drifting fragment of rock. That's one. Don't count, Mark said. Just keep shooting. They broke through the first line of ships, but the swarm wasn't breaking. They were regrouping, forming a wedge ahead to cut off the escape vector entirely. Mark's eyes flicked to the nav display. Off to port, barely a sliver on the readout, was a dense asteroid belt. Change course, now. The pilot hesitated. Asteroid field is unstable. Navigation wasn't a suggestion, Mark snapped. The ship dove into the field, and chaos followed. Massive chunks of rock tumbled through space, some big enough to blot out the stars, others spinning in tight clusters. The Ulthari chased them in, but their numbers worked against them. Ships collided with rock, slammed into each other, or were ripped apart by sudden debris showers. Dalton laughed over the comms. They're eating themselves alive. Don't celebrate yet, Mark said. We're not out. He had the pilot thread them deeper into the belt, weaving through gaps barely wider than the ship's wings. The Ulthari pursuit thinned with each maneuver, until only a handful of ships remained. When they finally broke out the far side, the stars opened up ahead of them, and there was nothing blocking their jump vector. They didn't jump straight back to the fortress. Mark had the pilot angled toward a cold, uninhabited moon on the edge of the corridor. They sat down in a crater, shields up, engines idling low. Dalton stepped off the ramp into the powdery dust, looking at Mark. Why the pit stop? Because, Mark said, scanning the horizon, if we go straight back now, we take whoever's tracking us right to the Emperor's front door, and if he's half as paranoid as I think, he'll take that as a reason to put a knife in our backs before they can. Dalton exhaled slowly. So we wait. Mark nodded. We wait. And we figure out why the Ulthari wanted us alive long enough to spring that trap. They didn't have to wait long. An hour later, one of the Dominion soldiers called them to the comm station. A transmission was coming through, not on Dominion channels, but an open-band, low-power signal. Mark had it patched through. The screen flickered, and the face that appeared was not Dominion, not human. The alien skin was the deep green of tarnished copper, its eyes narrow and dark. Its voice was low, measured, almost amused. Humans, you fought well on Kharid, better than the Emperor's other pets. Dalton's tone was ice. You with the Ulthari? I am their commander, the alien said without hesitation. And I know the Emperor sent you there to die. I also know you are not his loyal dogs. Mark didn't move, didn't blink. What do you want? The alien smiled faintly. To make you an offer. The Dominion thinks humans are just another tool. I think you are a weapon. Work with me, and you will not be disposable pawns. You will be allies. Dalton glanced at Mark. He's offering us a job. Mark kept his eyes on the screen. And the catch? You kill for the Dominion. You get nothing but survival. Kill for me, and I will give you something the Emperor never will. Freedom. The transmission cut before Mark could answer. Back on the ramp, Dalton crossed his arms. So what now? Take the offer? Mark stared out at the horizon of the dead moon. We take the intel. The Ulthari think we're good enough to recruit. The Emperor thinks we're good enough to send into a meat grinder. That means we're worth more than either side's willing to admit. Dalton grinned faintly. which means we play both until one makes the mistake of trusting us. Mark's mouth twitched in something close to a smile. Exactly. When they finally jumped back toward Dominion space, the path was clear. The Emperor's fortress loomed ahead, its spires catching the light of the nearby sun. Mark knew the questions would start the moment they docked. He also knew the answers he'd give would be carefully chosen. Just enough truth to keep the Emperor's interest, and just enough omission to keep the Ulthari's offer alive. For the first time since stepping into this galaxy, they weren't just reacting. They had options, and that made them dangerous. Docking back at the Emperor's fortress felt like walking into the lion's mouth. The docking arm sealed with a hiss, and before the ramp had even lowered, a full squad of the Emperor's elite guards stood waiting. Their armor gleamed black, accented with thin red lines that pulsed faintly, like veins. The insect-eyed helmets turned in perfect unison to follow Mark and Dalton as they stepped down. No one spoke. The guards formed up around them and led the way through the fortress's cold, echoing corridors. Dalton leaned just close enough for Mark to hear. "We're either getting medals or spaced." Mark didn't answer. He could feel the tension in the air, the kind that came before a trigger was pulled. They were brought to the throne room directly, bypassing the waiting chambers. The massive black doors swung open, and the Emperor was already standing at the foot of his throne, his molten gold eyes fixed on them. "You return, later than expected." Mark's tone was even. "Ran into resistance." "I am aware." The Emperor's gaze sharpened, like a predator catching the scent of blood. "A fleet-sized resistance, in an asteroid field that was not on your assigned route." Dalton opened his mouth, but Mark cut him off with a half-truth. "The Ulthari pulled us out of jump, ambush. We punched through, used the belt for cover." The Emperor's fingers tapped once on his metal armrest. "And yet, you survived." Mark let a faint edge into his voice. "You sent us out there with a handful of guards and a gunship that wasn't built for fleet work. Surviving wasn't the surprise." The Emperor's gaze lingered on him for a moment too long. Then he spoke. "Carid Prime remains under Dominion control. For now, that is acceptable. You will rest. Your next orders will come soon." They were dismissed without ceremony, which told Mark more than words could. Their new quarters were higher in the fortress, still small, but with a view of the void. Dalton shut the door behind them and exhaled. "He knows something's off." Mark dropped into the chair by the viewport. "Doesn't matter if he knows, matters if he can prove it." Dalton frowned. "You think the Ulthari commander's going to contact us again?" "He will," Mark said. "And when he does, we listen. Doesn't mean we do what he wants, but we make sure we're not just pawns in the Emperor's game." 3 days later, the Emperor's orders came. A Dominion courier brought a sealed case and a datapad. The case contained updated weapons, a pair of compact, high-output energy rifles and combat knives with alloyed edges that shimmered faintly in the light. The datapad held the mission brief: infiltration and sabotage of a relay station deep in Ulthari space. The station's function was clear. It handled encrypted communications between Ulthari fleets. Destroy it, and their coordination would take a hit. Dalton looked up from the datapad. "Sounds straightforward." Mark scanned the specs. "Straightforward missions are the ones that get you killed. If I were them, I'd have that station rigged to trap anyone who tries to take it." Dalton smirked. "Guess we'll find out." They left the fortress on a courier frigate, faster and sleeker than their last ride, with no guards this time. Just them, 2 pilots, and the mission. The jump into Ulthari space was smooth, but Mark's gut was already telling him they weren't alone. He spent the entire trip watching the sensors, noting the faint blips that came and went too regularly to be natural. Halfway to the relay station, the comm panel lit up. Not with a Dominion code, but an open band signal. Mark answered without hesitation. The Ulthari commander's green, tarnished copper face appeared, the faintest smile on his lips. "I knew you would come," he said, "and I knew it would be for something important." Dalton crossed his arms. "You tracking us now?" The Ulthari ignored him, eyes on Mark. "That station you're going to destroy, it's not just communications. It's where we keep the evidence that the Dominion has been violating the old treaties, evidence that could turn half their allies into enemies overnight." Mark didn't flinch. "You want us to steal it instead of blowing it up?" "Exactly," the Ulthari commander said. "Get me the files, and I will make sure you are no longer disposable to anyone." Dalton gave a humorless laugh. "And if we just blow it like we were told?" "Then the Dominion's lies remain hidden, and you remain tools." The signal cut without waiting for an answer. Dalton turned to Mark. "We can't play both sides forever. Eventually, one's going to figure out we're lying to them." Mark looked out the viewport at the streak of stars. "That's the point. We make sure they both think we're more useful alive than dead, even if they know we're lying." Dalton shook his head. "You're going to get us killed." Mark's voice was calm. "Maybe, but not today." The relay station hung in space like a spined sea creature, its long antenna arrays stretching out in every direction. It rotated slowly, the metallic surface catching faint glints from a nearby star. The frigate's stealth systems got them close enough to dock on an unmonitored maintenance port. Inside, the station's corridors were narrow, with panels that hummed faintly from the power running through them. Ulthari technicians moved about, none armed, though the occasional guard in light armor patrolled the halls. Mark led the way to the data core, bypassing the main access points, and instead following the maintenance ducts. Dalton grunted as he crawled through the cramped space. "You sure this leads to the core?" "I'm sure this leads somewhere the guards won't expect us," Mark replied. The data core was a cylindrical chamber 3 decks high, filled with glowing columns of vertical storage units. A single Ulthari officer worked at the main terminal. Mark signaled to Dalton. One quick strike, and the officer went down without a sound. Dalton moved to the terminal. "I can get the files, but I need time." Mark took up a position by the door. "You've got 5 minutes." The Dominion's orders had been clear. Overload the core. Detonate the station. The Ulthari's orders were equally clear. Extract the files. Doing both would require precision. Dalton's fingers flew over the terminal's alien interface. "Got the evidence. Dominion ship manifests in restricted zones. Intel logs from before the treaty expired. Enough to make the Emperor's head spin." Mark planted a charge on the far side of the core. "Now wipe the rest." Dalton triggered a purge program. The glowing columns began dimming one by one as the data burned out. The first alarm sounded just as they left the core. Ulthari guards rounded the corner ahead, rifles up. Mark dropped the first with a burst from his energy rifle, Dalton taking the second before he could fire. They moved fast, ducking into maintenance shafts when the main corridors got too hot. The station's rotation disoriented most people, but Mark navigated without hesitation, cutting through angles that brought them back to the docking port ahead of the Ulthari's response teams. By the time they launched, the first secondary explosions were blooming behind them, the core charges doing their work. Dalton exhaled hard in the cockpit. "So now we've got Dominion thinking we blew the place like good little soldiers, and Ulthari thinking we handed them their golden ticket." Mark sat back. "Exactly where I want us." The Emperor was waiting when they returned, not in the throne room, but in a private war council chamber. Maps of contested space floated as holograms in the air, dotted with Dominion and Ulthari fleet positions. He studied them as he spoke. The relay station is gone. You have done well. Mark inclined his head slightly. We keep our end of the deal. The Emperor's eyes flicked to him. And yet, I sense you have kept something for yourself. Dalton tensed, but Mark didn't blink. I keep breathing. That's what I keep. The Emperor smiled faintly, a predator amused by prey that bares its teeth. Good. You will need that skill. The next mission will be delicate. In the days that followed, Mark and Dalton began building something the Dominion didn't see coming. A network. Not of spies or soldiers, but of people caught between both powers. Smugglers, miners, disgraced Dominion officers, Ulthari defectors, anyone with a grudge and a willingness to trade information for favors. Every mission for the Emperor became 2 missions. One official, one unofficial. Every contact the Ulthari gave them became another point in the web. It was dangerous work, but for the first time since stepping into the Galactic Empire, they weren't just pieces on the board. They were starting to move the pieces themselves. The first sign the game was collapsing came as a whisper in a back corridor. A smuggler contact, one of the few Dominion citizens willing to deal in Ulthari goods, met Mark in a maintenance bay below the fortress docks. He was pale, sweating, and looked like a man who'd just been told the executioner was sharpening the axe. They know, the smuggler said. Both sides, not the details, but enough. The Emperor's pulling ships from the border. The Ulthari are consolidating in their core worlds. Everyone's preparing for something. Dalton leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed. Yeah, and guess who's going to be standing in the middle when it kicks off? Mark didn't respond immediately. His mind was already running scenarios, half of them ending with a blaster bolt in his back from one side or the other. The smuggler's voice cracked. You didn't hear this from me, but the Emperor's ordered your next mission to be non-return. And the Ulthari, they've put a bounty on your heads big enough to buy a small moon. Dalton gave a humorless laugh. Guess we made an impression? They met in their quarters that night. Mark had cleared the room of listening devices twice already, but he still kept his voice low. We're done playing middlemen, he said. Dalton frowned. You mean pick a side? Mark shook his head. I mean be the side. The Emperor wants control, the Ulthari want chaos. We give them both, but on our terms. We pull their fleets into the same system and let them tear each other apart. Dalton's grin was slow and sharp. And while they're bleeding each other dry, we take the leverage, Mark finished. Ships, stations, people. Enough to make them deal with us like equals or not at all. The plan took shape fast. The Ulthari wanted proof of the Dominion's treaty violations. They already had it from the relay station. The Emperor wanted to cripple Ulthari logistics. They knew exactly where the key supply depots were from their network of smugglers and defectors. All they had to do was feed each side just enough intel to make the other commit their main fleets to a decisive engagement. And choose the system. They picked Voreth's Gap, a dead sector between Dominion and Ulthari space, littered with debris fields from wars centuries past. The wreckage was dense enough to hide an entire armada until it was in firing range. Through coded channels, Dalton accidentally leaked a location of an Ulthari supply convoy to the Emperor's strategists. Through a separate line, Mark sold the Ulthari commander the timetable for a Dominion fleet movement near the same coordinates. Both sides bit. Hard. 2 weeks later, Voreth's Gap lit up like the birth of a star. Mark and Dalton watched from the bridge of a commandeered Ulthari courier ship, floating in the shadow of a derelict battleship that had been adrift since before humanity ever touched the stars. The Dominion fleet came in sleek and disciplined, wedge formations moving as one. The Ulthari swarmed in ragged packs, darting in and out of the debris like wolves. When the first volley hit, the whole sector shuddered with the exchange. Dalton's eyes were locked on the tactical display. "This is going to get ugly fast." "That's the point," Mark said. They weren't just watching. The moment the fleets were fully engaged, their network came alive. Smuggler ships and defected patrol craft emerged from the debris fields, hitting both sides' supply haulers, crippling comm relays, and hijacking damaged vessels. In the chaos, neither side could tell friend from foe. Every contact outside the main fleet was just another blip to eliminate. Dalton's voice was tight with focus. "We've got 3 Dominion corvettes breaking off from the fight, damaged but still moving. You want them?" Mark didn't hesitate. "Take the lead, board and strip 'em." By the 4th hour of the battle, Vorith's Gap was a graveyard. Dozens of ships drifted in ruin, their hulls glowing from internal fires. The Dominion's tight formations had fractured, Ulthari packs scattering under heavy losses. Mark had no illusions. Either side could rally if given the chance. That's why they weren't going to get one. He triggered a coded signal to the rest of their network. Small strike craft, hidden until now, surged from the wreckage to target the flagships of both fleets simultaneously. Not to destroy, just to wound enough to force a retreat. Dalton grinned as the tactical display lit up with new explosions. "Both sides just lost command control." "Exactly," Mark said. "Now we move." They emerged from the debris in their courier ship, broadcasting on open channels to both fleets. Mark's voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone who'd already proven he could survive their worst. "Dominion, Ulthari, you've both been played. By us. You can keep bleeding each other until there's nothing left, or you can deal with us and walk away with something to rebuild with. Your choice." Dalton cut the channel. "Think they'll take that well?" Mark's mouth twitched. "Doesn't matter. They'll take it." The fighting sputtered to a halt over the next hour. Not because either side trusted them, but because neither could afford to keep losing ships. The Emperor's molten gold gaze appeared on the comm first. "You presume much, human." "Only what I've earned," Mark said. "You came here to cripple the Ulthari. I did that. The rest is whether you can accept that your best move now is listening instead of killing." Minutes later, the Ulthari commander's green, weathered face appeared on a split channel. "Clever. Risky. You've made enemies today." Mark didn't blink. "And clients. Don't forget that part." The negotiations weren't peace. Not really. More like an armed ceasefire with both sides too busy counting the ships they had left to want another round. The deal was simple. Both the Dominion and Ulthari would leave Vorith's Gap to neutral administration. That administration was Mark and Dalton, backed by their growing fleet of stolen, salvaged, and defected ships. The Emperor didn't like it. The Ulthari didn't like it. But both liked the alternative less. Weeks later, Mark stood on the bridge of their new flagship, a refitted Dominion destroyer bristling with Ulthari weapon systems. The viewport showed the tangled wreckage of Vorith's Gap slowly being cleared by crews loyal to no flag, but theirs. Dalton came up beside him, a datapad in hand. "We've got 5 new ships pledging to the network this week. 2 Dominion deserters, 1 Ulthari captain, and a pair of independent haulers looking for protection." Mark nodded. "Keep them spread across the outer lanes. No clusters big enough to make either side nervous." Dalton smirked. "You ever think we'd end up running our own slice of the galaxy?" Mark's gaze stayed on the stars. "I didn't think we'd live this long." Dalton chuckled. "Guess we've seen worse." Mark finally allowed himself a small, humorless smile. Yeah. And now they're gonna see worse too if they come for us.